It was early evening inside the underground subway station, a place that never truly slept. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly above tiled walls stained by years of passing crowds. The air smelled faintly of metal, damp concrete, and hurried lives moving in every direction at once. Trains arrived and departed with mechanical precision, their brakes screeching, doors opening, people rushing through without slowing down. Near the edge of the platform stood a young boy, no more than 15. His hoodie was thin, the fabric worn at the cuffs, and a small tear near the elbow hinted at how long he had owned it. A faded backpack hung loosely from one shoulder. Inside it were schoolbooks, a folded bus schedule, and nothing else of value. In his hand, tucked tightly inside his palm, was a single $20 bill, the last of the money he had. He wasn't supposed to be here this late. He knew that, but tonight, circumstances had pushed him off schedule. A missed connection, a delayed train, small problems that didn't seem big to anyone else, but mattered when you had no extra cash, no ride waiting, and no backup plan. The boy glanced down at the digital board overhead, then back at the platform. That was when he noticed her. An elderly woman sat alone on a wooden bench against the tiled wall. Her gray hair curled softly around her face, and her blue cardigan looked carefully buttoned, as if she still cared deeply about appearances. Her hands rested in her lap, thin and slightly trembling. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't speaking to anyone. She simply sat there, staring ahead, as if waiting for something, or someone, that wasn't coming. People passed her without looking twice. The boy slowed his steps. Something about her presence felt different. Not loud, not desperate, just quiet, heavy, and lonely. He stopped several feet away, pretending to check his phone even though the screen was dark. His eyes returned to her again. She looked cold. He thought about his own situation. The $20 would cover a cheap meal and the bus home. Without it, he would be walking for miles. He pictured the long streets, the darkness, the uncertainty. His fingers tightened around the bill. A train thundered past, wind rushing through the station. When it cleared, the woman was still there, unmoving. The boy took a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He stepped closer. The sounds of the station faded slightly as his focus narrowed to the bench, the woman, and the decision pressing against his chest. He stopped in front of her. She looked up, surprised, her eyes sharp despite her age. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The boy swallowed, then slowly opened his hand. Inside lay the $20 bill. "This will help you, ma'am," he said quietly. The woman stared at the money, then at him. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Around them, the station continued moving, unaware that a small moment, barely visible, easily ignored, had just begun. The elderly woman did not reach for the money right away. Her eyes remained fixed on the bill resting in the boy's open palm, as if she were unsure whether it was real or something she had imagined. The noise of the subway faded into a distant hum as the moment stretched longer than either of them expected. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to the boy's face. "You don't have to do that," she said, her voice soft but steady. There was no accusation in her tone, only concern. "You're young, you should keep it." The boy hesitated, his hand lowered slightly, then steadied again. He had already crossed the line where turning back felt impossible. He shook his head once. A small, deliberate motion. "I'm okay," he replied. It wasn't entirely true, but he didn't say anything more. He didn't explain his situation or ask questions about hers. He simply stood there, waiting. The woman studied him more closely now. She noticed the worn edges of his sleeves, the scuffed sneakers, the way his backpack sagged as if it carried more weight than it should. Her expression shifted, something between disbelief and quiet understanding. At last, she reached out. Her fingers trembled as they closed around the bill. The contact was brief, but it carried a weight that felt far heavier than the money itself. She held it carefully, as though afraid it might disappear if she moved too quickly. "Thank you," she whispered. The words caught in her throat. She cleared it gently and tried again. "You have no idea what this means." The boy nodded, unsure how to respond. He gave a small, polite smile, the kind people use when they want to end a conversation without making it awkward. He stepped back, adjusting the strap of his backpack on his shoulder. Behind them, An announcement echoed through the station, calling out the arrival of another train. Doors slid open. People surged forward. The boy turned toward the platform edge, then paused. For a brief second, he looked back. The woman was still seated, her hands now folded in her lap, the bill tucked safely between her fingers. Her eyes followed him as he walked away. He boarded the next train without looking back again. As the doors closed and the train pulled away, the woman exhaled slowly. She stared down at her hands, then unfolded them. The $20 bill lay there, slightly creased from being held too tightly. Her shoulders shook once, then again. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over quietly as she pressed the bill to her chest. For the first time that evening, she wasn't invisible anymore, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like someone had truly seen her. The train doors closed with a dull metallic thud, and the platform slowly returned to its usual rhythm. People shifted their bags, checked their phones, and moved toward exits without noticing what had just taken place a few steps away. To them, it was an ordinary evening in an ordinary station. The elderly woman remained seated on the bench, still holding the $20 bill. She didn't look up right away. Her breathing was uneven, controlled but fragile, as if she were trying not to draw attention to herself. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, then smoothed the front of her cardigan, restoring a sense of order before anyone could notice her tears. Across the platform, two commuters exchanged a brief glance. One shrugged, another turned away. Moments passed, and whatever curiosity had flickered was gone. No one asked questions. No one intervened. The woman slowly folded the bill and placed it inside the small fabric purse resting beside her. She closed the zipper carefully, then wrapped both hands around the purse as though it were something precious. Something that could be taken away if she loosened her grip. She leaned back against the tiled wall and closed her eyes. For a moment, memories surfaced, things she hadn't allowed herself to think about in a long time. A warm kitchen, a dining table with more than one chair, a voice calling her name. The memory faded as quickly as it came, but the feeling lingered. The boy's face returned to her mind. His calm expression, the certainty in his voice, the way he hadn't hesitated. Another train announcement echoed through the station, pulling her back into the present. She opened her eyes and looked down the platform, half expecting to see him still there. He was gone. All that remained was the empty space where he had stood. The woman straightened slightly. She adjusted her posture, drawing a slow, steady breath. For the first time that night, she felt capable of standing up. Not physically stronger, but steadier inside. She rose from the bench and walked toward the station exit at an unhurried pace. Each step felt deliberate, as though she were reclaiming control over something she had lost. Outside the station, the evening air was cool. Street lights cast long reflections across the sidewalk. The woman paused near the entrance, resting one hand against the wall. She reached into her purse once more, touching the folded bill to reassure herself it was still there. It mattered, she murmured softly, to no one in particular. Back on the tracks, another train rushed through the station, carrying strangers to destinations unknown. And somewhere beyond the tunnels, a young boy was already moving forward, unaware that his simple act on a crowded platform had just shifted the course of someone else's night, and perhaps much more than that. Inside the moving subway car, the boy stood near the door, one hand gripping the metal pole as the train rocked gently from side to side. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, casting pale reflections across the windows. The car wasn't full, but it wasn't empty either. Passengers sat in silence, lost in their own routines. Earbuds in, eyes down. The boy shifted his weight and glanced around. No one paid him any attention. That was normal. He was used to blending into the background. He reached into the pocket of his hoodie out of habit, then stopped. There was nothing there. He let his hand fall back to his side. For a brief moment, reality settled in fully. The $20 was gone. There would be no meal tonight. No bus ride home. Just distance and time between him and wherever he would end up sleeping. He swallowed and looked down at the floor. The train slowed as it approached the next station. The boy stepped aside to let others exit, then remained where he was as the doors opened and closed again. He wasn't counting stops. He already knew where he needed to get off. What he didn't know was how he would get the rest of the way. As the train continued forward, His reflection appeared in the darkened window. He studied it briefly, his tired eyes. The set of his jaw. There was no panic in his expression. Only calculation. He had faced worse nights before. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and checked its contents. Though he already knew what was inside. Schoolbooks. A pencil. A crumpled notebook. No money. No food. The car rocked again, and an announcement crackled overhead. The boy barely listened. His thoughts were elsewhere, moving through options that weren't great but were still possible. Walk part of the way. Rest if needed. Keep moving. When the train reached his stop, he stepped onto the platform and waited as the doors slid shut behind him. The station here was quieter. Smaller. With fewer people moving through. The echoes of footsteps bounced off the walls. Then faded. He climbed the stairs toward street level. Each step feeling heavier than the last. At the top, he paused, hands on the railing, catching his breath. The night air greeted him as he pushed through the exit doors. Outside, the city stretched ahead, long streets, dim lights, and the unfamiliar silence that came after the rush of the station. He checked his phone again. Still no notifications, still no help coming. The boy looked down the road, then back at the station behind him. For just a second, doubt flickered across his face, but it passed quickly. He pulled his hoodie tighter, squared his shoulders, and started walking. Behind him, the subway doors closed once more, sealing off the underground world where he had made a choice that would follow him far beyond this night. Back at the original subway station, the evening rush had begun to thin. Trains still arrived and departed, but the crowds were smaller now. Their movements slower, less urgent. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, illuminating empty sections of the platform where moments earlier people had stood shoulder to shoulder. The elderly woman remained seated near the wall. She had not moved far since the boy left. Her purse rested in her lap, both hands placed firmly on top of it, as if anchoring herself to the bench. She watched another train pull in, then out again, its doors opening to a handful of passengers before closing with a familiar mechanical sound. Only after the platform cleared further did she finally open her purse. Inside, among a few worn personal items, lay the folded $20 bill. She took it out slowly and smoothed it against her knee. The creases softened under her fingers, but the weight of the gesture behind it did not. She stared at the bill for a long time. It wasn't the amount that overwhelmed her. It was the certainty with which it had been given. No conditions, no hesitation, no expectation of anything in return. The boy hadn't asked her name. He hadn't asked what she needed. He had simply seen her and acted. Her breathing grew uneven again. She pressed her lips together, trying to remain composed, but her eyes filled despite her effort. One tear slipped down her cheek, then another. She quickly wiped them away, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. A few commuters passed by, absorbed in their own thoughts. No one stopped, no one noticed. The woman let out a slow, quiet breath. She folded the bill carefully and held it between both hands, resting them against her chest. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes. This was kindness, she whispered. The word felt unfamiliar, not because she had never known it, but because it had been absent for so long. She sat there, allowing the feeling to settle, grounding herself in it. When she opened her eyes again, her expression had changed. The exhaustion was still there, but something else had joined it, a sense of resolve. She looked down the platform toward the exit, then back at the tracks. Another announcement echoed through the station, signaling the final trains of the evening. The woman shifted forward on the bench and pushed herself to her feet. Her movements were slow, but deliberate. She adjusted her cardigan, lifted her purse, and took one last look at the empty space where the boy had stood earlier. Then she turned and began walking toward the exit, the sound of her footsteps steady against the tiled floor. Whatever came next, she would face it differently than she had before. The temporary shelter was quiet when the elderly woman arrived. The building sat on a narrow side street, its exterior worn and unremarkable, easily overlooked by anyone passing by in a hurry. Inside, the lighting was dim but warm, and the air carried the faint smell of soup and disinfectant. She signed her name carefully at the front desk, her handwriting slow but deliberate. The volunteer nodded and handed her a small tray along with a paper cup of water. No questions were asked beyond what was necessary. No explanations were demanded. For that, she was grateful. She carried the tray to a small table near the wall and sat down. On it sat a bowl of hot soup, a piece of bread, and a few basic supplies. She stared at the steam rising from the bowl for a moment, letting the warmth reach her face before lifting the spoon. The first sip made her pause. It had been longer than she cared to admit since she'd eaten something hot. She continued slowly, careful not to rush, aware of how easily simple comforts could overwhelm her. Around her, a few other residents ate in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Afterward, a staff member handed her a small packet containing medication she had mentioned earlier. The woman accepted it with a quiet nod, slipping it into her purse. She felt a subtle sense of relief, not because her problems were solved, but because tonight, at least, she could rest. She was shown to a modest room with a narrow bed, a small table, and a chair. It wasn't much, but it was clean. She set her purse on the table and sat down slowly, letting the day settle into her bones. She opened the purse once more. The $20 bill was still there. She placed it gently on the table, then reached deeper into the bag and pulled out a folded photograph. The edges were worn, the image faded from years of handling. It showed a younger version of herself standing beside a man and a small child. All three smiling into the camera. A different life, a different time. She traced the outline of the photograph with her finger, then looked back at the bill. The connection between the two felt sudden and sharp. The boy's face flashed in her mind again, his calm expression, his certainty. She folded the bill and placed it back into her purse, this time with intention. Lying down on the bed, she pulled the thin blanket over herself and stared at the ceiling. The room was quiet, safe. Outside, the city continued on without her. But inside these walls, she allowed herself to rest. That night, she slept more deeply than she had in weeks, holding onto the knowledge that kindness, unexpected and undeserved, had found her when she needed it most. Morning arrived quietly for the boy. The sky was still pale when he stepped into the school building. Shoulders slightly hunched, backpack resting low against his back. He had walked most of the night, stopping only once to rest on a bench when his legs began to shake. By the time he reached school, fatigue clung to him like an extra layer of weight. The hallways buzzed with the usual sounds, lockers opening, voices overlapping, footsteps echoing against tiled floors. To everyone else, it was an ordinary day. To him, it felt longer than most. He slid into his seat near the back of the classroom and rested his arms on the desk. His eyes stayed forward, but his focus drifted. His stomach tightened, empty and aching. Though he ignored it, he had learned how. The teacher began the lesson, writing across the board in neat lines. The boy copied the notes automatically, his handwriting steady despite the tiredness in his hands. He didn't want attention. He rarely did. When lunchtime came, students gathered their things and headed toward the cafeteria. The boy remained seated, pretending to finish an assignment. After a few minutes, the room emptied. Only then did he stand and step into the hallway. He walked slowly, not toward the cafeteria, but toward the far end of the building where the benches were quieter. He sat down and leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. A staff member passed by, then stopped. "Why aren't you eating?" she asked gently. The boy opened his eyes and straightened. "I'm not hungry," he replied. The words came easily. They always did. She looked at him for a second longer than expected, then nodded and continued down the hall. The boy exhaled once she was gone. Later that afternoon, back in class, his attention wavered again. The room felt warmer than usual. The words on the board blurred slightly. He blinked hard and focused, refusing to let his body dictate his actions. When the final bell rang, he packed his bag and stood. Outside, the air was cool, the sun already lowering. He began the long walk home without complaint, moving steadily down familiar streets. He didn't know that miles away, an elderly woman had woken up that same morning with a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't know that his small act had stayed with her through the night. All he knew was that he had done what felt right. And for now, that was enough. The community assistance office opened early that morning. The building was modest, with plain signage and wide windows that let in natural light. Inside, Desks were arranged neatly, and the low murmur of conversation filled the space as people waited their turn. The elderly woman sat across from a caseworker, her purse resting on her lap. She held it carefully, the way someone holds onto something important even when they aren't aware of it. Her posture was straight, her voice calm as she answered questions about her situation. When the caseworker asked how she had managed the night before, the woman paused. She hesitated, then spoke. "Someone helped me," she said quietly. The caseworker looked up, attentive but neutral. "A friend? A family member?" "No," the woman replied. "A boy. I don't know his name." She explained what had happened at the subway station the evening before. She described the platform, the bench, the way the boy had stood in front of her and offered the money without being asked. She did not dramatize it. She did not raise her voice. She simply stated the facts. As she spoke, her hands tightened slightly around her purse. The caseworker listened without interrupting. When the woman finished, there was a brief silence. Then the caseworker nodded. "That kind of thing doesn't happen often," she said. The woman met her eyes. "It should," she replied. The caseworker smiled faintly and returned to the paperwork, making notes and explaining the next steps. Temporary housing options, meal programs, medical follow-ups. The woman listened carefully, asking questions when needed. Before the meeting ended, she spoke again. "If there is any way to find him," she said, "I would like that." The caseworker considered this. "We can ask around," she said honestly, "but without a name, it may be difficult." "I understand," the woman said, "but I want to try." Later that afternoon, she left the office with a small folder of information and directions. She stood outside for a moment, adjusting the strap of her purse on her shoulder. She reached inside and touched the folded $20 bill. Still there. It was no longer just money. It had become a responsibility. She looked down the street, then turned and began walking toward the bus stop. She didn't know where the boy was or whether she would ever see him again. But she knew one thing clearly. She would not let his kindness end with her. The school grounds were quieter in the late afternoon. Most students had already left, and the usual noise of the day had softened into scattered voices and distant footsteps. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the pavement and the worn grass near the fence. The boy sat alone on a bench near the edge of the yard. His backpack rested at his feet, unzipped, as he waited for his legs to recover before starting the walk home. He stared ahead without much focus, his thoughts drifting between homework, distance, and the familiar calculation of how long it would take to get back. He didn't notice the woman at first. She stood just beyond the school gate, holding a folder in one hand and her purse in the other. She paused there, uncertain, scanning the yard slowly. Children moved past her in small groups, laughing, unaware of her presence. Then her eyes settled on the bench. She recognized him immediately. The worn hoodie, the faded backpack, the posture that carried both youth and quiet responsibility. Her breath caught as she took a step forward. Then another. The boy sensed movement and looked up. For a moment, he didn't understand what he was seeing. The woman from the subway stood a few yards away, her hair neatly combed, her cardigan clean. She looked different, steadier, but unmistakably the same person. They stared at each other in silence. "You," he said finally, rising halfway from the bench. "Yes," she replied. Her voice trembled slightly. "It's you." He stood fully now, unsure whether to move closer or stay where he was. The woman closed the distance herself, stopping a respectful step away. She smiled, though her eyes filled with emotion. "I've been looking for you," she said. The boy frowned, confused. "Why?" She opened her purse and took out the folded bill. She didn't hand it back. She simply held it between her fingers. "Because what you did mattered," she said, "more than you know." The boy shook his head. "I just helped," he said quietly. "Anyone would." She met his eyes. "Not everyone does." For a moment, neither spoke. The sounds of the street filtered in beyond the fence. The woman reached out, hesitated, then gently placed her hand over his. "Thank you," she said again. "I needed you that night." The boy swallowed, uncomfortable with the attention, but he didn't pull away. As they stood there, the space between them felt small, Two lives that had crossed briefly on a crowded platform now stood face to face in the open air, changed in ways neither had expected. They walked together toward the small park across the street from the school. The late afternoon light softened everything, the trees, the benches, the quiet paths that curved gently through the grass. It was a place people passed through without much thought. But today it felt intentional, as if it had been waiting. They sat on a bench facing the open space. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the woman took a slow breath. "I want you to understand something," she said. "I wasn't always lost." Her voice was steady now, measured. She told him about the life she had lived before, working, raising a family, belonging somewhere. She didn't linger on details or dramatize the past. She simply explained how time, loss, and circumstances had slowly narrowed her world until that subway bench was all that remained. "When you stopped," she said, "you reminded me of who I was before everything fell apart." The boy listened quietly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look away. She reached into her purse and removed the folded $20 bill one last time. She placed it between them on the bench. "I'm keeping this," she said, "not to spend, but to remember." Then she looked at him. "And because of you, I've been given help. Real help. I'm not alone anymore." The boy nodded, absorbing her words without knowing what to say. "I didn't do it for that," he said finally. "I just didn't want you to be alone." She smiled. "And that is exactly why it mattered." They sat in silence again. Comfortable this time. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the ground. A breeze moved through the trees. Before leaving, the woman stood and adjusted her cardigan. "I won't forget you," she said, "and someday, when I can, I'll pass this forward." The boy stood as well. "You already did," he replied. They parted there, no promises, no expectations, just understanding. As the boy started down the long road home, his steps felt lighter than they had the night before. He still had no money, still had distance ahead of him, but something had shifted. Kindness had moved through him and returned in a way he hadn't anticipated, not as reward, but as meaning. And that stayed with him long after the day was over.